Young girl mocks veteran's walker in grocery store, learns of his injury. Nashville, a city known for its rhythm and the heartbeat of country music, has a charm that settles deep into the fabric of its neighborhoods. It's not the grand skyscrapers or the bustling downtown nightlife that define the city for most residents. Instead, it's the quiet corners, the familiar faces, and the unhurried pace of everyday life. For Lily and her mother, Laura, the small grocery store they visited every Saturday afternoon was more than just a place to buy food. It was a part of their routine, their rhythm in a world that often seemed too fast to keep up with. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Lily had always liked the routine of it. Every week, after school on Friday, she and Laura would make their list, check off what they needed for the week, and head to the store on Saturday. The store was a small, family-owned market in the heart of their neighborhood, and Lily couldn't remember a time when she hadn't been coming here. The aisles smelled like fresh bread and produce, and the creaky wooden floors always made it feel like stepping into another era, one where things moved at a slower pace. The shelves were lined with bright cans and packages, comforting and predictable. The store had become something of a sanctuary for Lily. There were no long lines, no crowds to dodge, and most importantly, it was familiar. She knew where the peanut butter was, knew that the cereal aisle was always right before the dairy section, and she could always count on the grocer, Mr. Simmons, to be stocking the oranges with a smile and a friendly hello. Every visit was punctuated by a pleasant ritual, gathering up a few items, chatting briefly with Mr. Simmons, and even giving a small wave to a few of the elderly neighbors who were always there at the same time. This Saturday was no different. Lily had woken up that morning with the sun streaming through her bedroom window, the faint smell of pancakes coming from the kitchen, and the soft hum of her mother humming along to some old country tune on the radio. The kind of Saturday that promised a sense of safety and routine. After finishing breakfast, Laura had casually mentioned that it was time for their weekly trip to the store, and Lily, always eager to see what new treats might be waiting on the shelves, had immediately jumped to her feet. The store was warm, its air scented with baked goods and the faint tang of fresh produce. There was a pleasant low hum of conversation, the sound of shopping carts scraping along the floors, and the occasional clang of cans being stacked or dropped. The shelves were stocked high, a comforting reminder of the small, simple things in life. Lily had made her usual beeline for the candy aisle. She knew, just as she did every week, that she'd have to spend a few moments deliberating between her two favorite treats, a chocolate bar with almonds or a pack of gummy bears. As her mother pushed the cart lazily down the aisles, Lily found herself in a world where the smallest decisions, like which candy to buy, felt monumental. She could already hear her mother's voice calling her name, reminding her to hurry up, to make her choice so they could finish their shopping. She was used to this dance of routine, the small tasks that filled up the minutes and hours. Laura, Lily's mother, was everything Lily had ever known. She was a constant presence in her life, steady, reliable, and familiar. When Lily was younger, she'd often sit in the cart while Laura pushed it through the aisles, glancing at the items on the shelves with wide eyes, taking it all in. As she had grown older, though, Lily was no longer in the cart. She walked beside her mother, chatting about her week at school or asking if they could stop by the park after they were done. The grocery store was a safe, predictable place, and there was nothing about it that made Lily feel uneasy or unsure. Laura, on the other hand, was in a different headspace during these trips. For her, shopping wasn't just about picking up groceries. It was about managing time and budgets, making sure that they didn't overspend while still getting everything they needed for the week. She wasn't one to linger on aisles, chatting with the grocer, or inspecting every brand of canned beans. She'd learned long ago that time was something you couldn't waste. Her focus was always on efficiency. She moved through the store with a purpose, never stopping to look at the products she wasn't going to buy. Lily, in contrast, took the opportunity to explore, to wander, and make small decisions that didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things, but made her feel in control. Laura pushed the cart forward, absent-mindedly checking items off the list she had written in her notebook. She had long since stopped needing to look at the list to remember what to buy. A gallon of milk, bread, eggs, vegetables. These things were as ingrained in her mind as her morning routine. She had done it so many times that it was second nature now. As they neared the aisle that led to the dairy section, Lily's mind wandered to the other things she had come to expect on these trips: the people. The grocery store wasn't just about the products on the shelves. It was a place where their community came together. Some days, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor from a few streets over, would be there, and Lily would wave at her before she disappeared down another aisle. Or there was Mr. Jensen, who worked at the post office, who always seemed to pick the same day as Lily and her mother to stock up on groceries. These people were part of the fabric of Lily's life, and while she didn't know much about their personal histories, she understood, on a subconscious level, that the world in this store was one of routine and mutual recognition. They all had their small rituals, just like her mother. It was as if the store was an extension of the neighborhood itself, a place where everyone knew everyone, where you could walk in on any given day and see a familiar face. And for Lily, that was enough. The simplicity of the place made her feel like she was part of something larger, something that made sense. The predictable nature of the store was comforting to her, especially in a world where she was still figuring out so many things. She didn't have to worry about what was happening outside. School was always there, a series of tests and assignments that she managed to pass, but the pressures of being a preteen, the questions of who she was or what she wanted to be, hadn't yet fully hit her. This simple grocery store, with its familiar smells and sounds, was enough to ground her. The noise of the outside world, pressures from school, friends, and society, seemed to melt away when she was here with her mother. As they moved toward the back of the store, Lily noticed an older man with a walker moving slowly down the aisle. He was hunched slightly over, his hands gripping the metal bars of the walker. Lily's eyes narrowed a little as she took him in. She didn't recognize him immediately. He wasn't one of the regulars they usually saw, like Mrs. Thompson or Mr. Jensen. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, his face weathered with years of experience, though he didn't look particularly sick or frail. His clothes were plain, blue jeans and a worn flannel shirt, and there was something about his presence that made Lily's curiosity stir. The man seemed to struggle with his walker, moving slowly down the aisle with each careful step, his face tight with the effort. Lily stopped for a moment, watching him. Something about his slow movement caught her attention. The awkwardness of the walker, the way it made him sway with every step, seemed out of place in a store that was otherwise filled with the normal hum of activity. Lily, still only 10 years old, couldn't quite place it, but there was something about him that stood apart from the others in the store. Her first instinct was to giggle, to find some humor in the sight of him struggling with the walker. It wasn't meant to be mean, it was just the way children sometimes reacted to unfamiliar things they didn't understand. But there was no one to explain the situation to her. No one to tell her that the man's walker wasn't funny. She watched him struggle for another moment, and before she could stop herself, she let out a small, almost involuntary laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough for the man to notice. And that moment, that single giggle, would change everything for her. Lily didn't know it at the time, but the moment she let out that innocent giggle in the grocery store was the beginning of a shift in her understanding of the world, a shift she wasn't yet ready to recognize but would feel profoundly. In the blink of an eye, a small moment of childhood curiosity would collide with something much larger than her comprehension of life at that point. At first, though, Lily didn't realize the weight of what had just happened. She simply went back to her candy aisle deliberations. The laugh had come naturally, as it did sometimes when something seemed odd to her. There was no malice in it, no intent to hurt, but a child's impulse to react to something unfamiliar in a way that was sometimes thoughtless. She had no idea how the man, Frank, had perceived her. All she could think about were the gummy bears that were nestled just beneath the brightly colored candy bars. Was it going to be chocolate today or gummy bears? A trivial decision, sure, but one that, in Lily's mind, carried more weight than the presence of a man she didn't even know. The sound of the squeaky wheels of his walker had stuck with her, though. It had lodged itself in her mind like an annoying tune you can't get rid of. There was something about the sound, the deliberate pace of it, that seemed out of place. Everything else around her felt so fast, so effortless. The other customers breezed by, pushing their carts with casual ease, quickly grabbing items and moving on. But Frank was different. He was slower. He was a reminder that not everyone's life operated on the same rhythm as hers. Her mother, Laura, had told her to stop. Lily didn't fully grasp the seriousness of her mother's reaction in the moment. Laura's voice was calm but firm when she'd asked her daughter to stop laughing, but Lily couldn't understand why something so small had seemed to affect her mother so strongly. Why had Frank's struggle with the walker mattered so much? The child's world was a place of relative innocence, where things were either right or wrong, funny or boring. The complexity of human struggle, the kind that lived quietly beneath the surface of people's lives, was still a concept beyond Lily's grasp. But as they continued with their shopping, something inside Lily's mind started to stir. Her mother's short reprimand had planted a seed of discomfort in her. It wasn't a sense of guilt, at least not yet, but more like the feeling of something unspoken, something that had been left unsaid and was now waiting to be understood. It made her feel uneasy. It made her start to wonder about Frank. Who was he? Why did he walk like that? Why did his walker seem so awkward? Why was her mother so upset by her small laugh? At home later that day, Lily couldn't shake the image of Frank from her mind. The walk down the aisle had seemed so innocent at first, a simple moment in a routine shopping trip. But now, as she sat at the kitchen table eating her sandwich, her thoughts kept returning to him. She tried to imagine his life. What kind of person would need a walker? Someone old? Someone who had trouble with their legs? Her mind started to wander in directions it hadn't before. She thought about the elderly people in her life, grandparents and distant aunts and uncles who had all gotten older and frilier. But none of them had a walker. None of them had looked like Frank. It wasn't until later, when her mother mentioned that Frank was a veteran, that Lily's mind really began to grapple with the full weight of the situation. She had heard the word veteran before, usually in the context of Memorial Day or the occasional newscast featuring older men in uniforms saluting flags at ceremonies. But she hadn't ever really thought about what it meant to be a veteran. She didn't know anyone who was one. The word had always seemed abstract, like a distant concept. She knew that people who went to war were somehow brave, but the reality of what they experienced, and what that experience did to them, was still a mystery. Veterans don't just fight in wars for fun, Lily, Laura had said in a soft but serious tone. They go to protect people like you. They fight so that people can be free. Some of them don't come back the same. Some are hurt, like Frank. The gravity of her mother's words began to weigh on her. Lily had never really thought about war beyond the stories she'd read in history books or seen in movies. She had heard of soldiers, of battles, of victory and defeat, but the faces of those soldiers had always been distant, blurred by time and the simplification of history. The realities of what war did to people hadn't truly settled into her understanding yet. Lily asked more questions that evening, questions that had never crossed her mind before. What happened to him? How did he get hurt? Is that why he has the walker? Her mother hesitated before answering, as if she were weighing how much of the truth to impart. Finally, she said, Frank was in the military, Lily. He fought in a war, fought to keep us all safe. And he was hurt in that war. When soldiers go into combat, they don't always come out the same. They carry the wounds of their battles with them. The words felt heavy. Wounds, Lily thought. The words sounded so clinical, so detached from the idea of someone actually suffering. She couldn't imagine it. The pain, the fear, the loss. All of these things were foreign to her. She didn't understand what it would mean for a person's body to be hurt in ways that couldn't be fixed, to be wounded so deeply that the consequences lasted a lifetime. She had never seen anyone close to her in pain that way. Sure, she had scraped her knees, had gotten a bruise here and there, but the idea of carrying those injuries for years, of living with them, of being permanently changed by them, this was beyond anything she had experienced. The next day, Lily found herself thinking about Frank again. It was a bright, sunny Sunday, and she was sitting by the window, staring out at the neighborhood as birds flitted around in the trees. Her mind wasn't on anything in particular, just the usual lazy Sunday thoughts, but then the memory of his slow, deliberate movements in the grocery store came rushing back. She could hear his labored breathing, the squeak of his walker, the way he had struggled to move, and the look in his eyes. The look that seemed so resigned, so worn, that it made Lily want to know more. She couldn't help but wonder what Frank had seen, what he had endured. Was that why he walked with such difficulty? Was that why his face looked so weathered, like it had seen things no one should ever have to see? Lily tried to imagine it. The distant lands he must have fought in, the battlefields, the comrades who had been lost. She thought about what her mother had said. They carry the wounds with them. It felt so strange to her, so distant from her own life. But as much as she tried to push it away, the idea kept resurfacing in her thoughts. The world she had known, the world of her school, her friends, her small neighborhood, was filled with predictable events. Birthdays, summer vacations, the occasional family gathering. But now, something about Frank had introduced a new complexity into her world, one she wasn't prepared for. She was beginning to understand that there were stories, lives, and experiences beyond her little bubble. The world was far bigger and much more difficult than she had ever realized. It wasn't just about her. The world, as Lily was beginning to see, was full of people who carried burdens, who faced struggles that she had never imagined. Frank was just one of many who had lived through things Lily couldn't yet fathom. In her young mind, she had always thought of people as living simple lives, with simple problems. Her biggest issue, the one that occupied most of her thoughts, was whether she could finish her homework in time to watch her favorite TV show. It seemed so trivial now, compared to the weight that hung over Frank's life. The truth was, Lily had lived in a kind of bubble, a world where her needs and wants were met, where the struggles of the adults around her seemed far removed. Her mother, her father, even her teachers, they were all part of a stable, unshakable world that didn't have room for the complexities of injury or loss. But now, after hearing her mother speak about Frank, after seeing him struggle in the grocery store, Lily couldn't stop thinking about the fact that not everyone lived the way she did. Not everyone had the luxury of walking down a grocery store aisle with ease. Not everyone was untouched by the world's harsher realities. For the first time in her life, Lily felt a deep sense of uncertainty, a recognition that her simple, predictable world was just a small part of a much larger, much more complicated picture. The question now was how she would navigate that new understanding. How would she see the world from now on? What would she do with the knowledge that some things, some struggles, were too great to ignore? Lily wasn't sure yet, but she felt the first stirrings of change within her. A shift, a moment of growth. And she knew that she couldn't unsee what she had seen. The days following the brief encounter with Frank in the grocery store felt like a quiet turning point in Lily's life. It wasn't a grand event, no dramatic shifts or sudden realizations, but something inside her had begun to stir, quietly and persistently. The world that she had always taken for granted, a world filled with routines and simple pleasures, suddenly felt smaller, more layered, and far more complex than she had ever imagined. She hadn't forgotten the man with the walker, nor the unsettling mix of curiosity and discomfort that had washed over her after her mother's explanation of his injury. And now, in the days that followed, those thoughts kept resurfacing. It was the following Saturday when Lily found herself once again walking into the same grocery store, pushing her cart alongside her mother, but this time, there was something different in the air. The store felt the same, the shelves filled with brightly colored products, the smell of freshly baked bread in the air, and the quiet hum of background music playing softly over the speakers. But this time, Lily was more aware of everything. She couldn't help it. Her mind kept drifting back to Frank, the man she had laughed at, the man she had misunderstood. She hadn't really given him much thought when they'd left the store that first day, but now, she couldn't shake the image of him, struggling with his walker, as if he were fighting against something much larger than himself. It was as though the whole world had shifted in a way she didn't fully understand. Her mother had continued to mention Frank in the days that followed, and each time she spoke about him, Lily felt a small twinge of guilt, though she couldn't quite articulate why. It wasn't the giggle that bothered her. It was the deeper realization that she hadn't known what to make of him. That she had thought it was something to laugh at when, in fact, it was something to understand. Something to respect. Her mind had begun to open in a way that was both uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. She had always been content in her small world, her little routine, her predictable surroundings. But now she was faced with the fact that there were complexities, things that didn't fit neatly into the boxes she had built for herself. The grocery store visit was an ordinary one for the most part. Lily and her mother followed their usual routine. Pick out the fruits, grab the vegetables, choose the right bread, and stock up on the essentials. But as they turned the corner toward the dairy aisle, Lily froze. There, at the far end of the aisle, was Frank again. This time, he wasn't alone. He was talking to Mr. Simmons, the grocer, who had a friendly smile on his face as he listened intently. Frank's walker stood firmly by his side, his hand resting lightly on the metal frame as he chatted with the storekeeper. For a moment, Lily stood there, watching them, unsure of what to do. She could hear her mother's voice from a few steps ahead, calling her to come along, but Lily didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on Frank. She hadn't expected to see him again, and certainly not so soon. But here he was, living his life, moving through the world just like everyone else, despite the difficulty of each step. It was in this quiet moment that Lily realized how little she truly knew about him, about anyone who didn't live in the same predictable rhythm of her world. For some reason, this time, she didn't laugh. Instead, she felt a deep sense of hesitation. Something inside her made her want to walk over and introduce herself, to ask him questions, to learn more about the life that had shaped him into the person he was. But at the same time, she felt a wave of uncertainty. What if she said the wrong thing? What if she embarrassed herself again? What if Frank didn't want to talk to her? Or worse, what if she made him uncomfortable? As she stood there, lost in thought, she realized that the discomfort she had once felt when she laughed at Frank was now being replaced by something else, an urge to understand. To understand him. To understand what it meant to be someone like Frank, someone who had experienced things she could barely imagine, things that had left visible scars. But understanding would mean stepping outside of her comfortable, familiar world, the world where everything made sense and where the rules were simple. It wasn't long before her mother called her again, this time more urgently. "Lily, come on, sweetie. Let's finish up." With a reluctant sigh, Lily turned and walked toward her mother, her thoughts racing. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like this encounter was important. There was something there, something that was calling to her, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. That afternoon, back at home, Lily sat on her bed, flipping through a book she had started reading for school. But her mind wasn't on the words. Instead, it kept returning to Frank and the silent weight of his struggle. How had he ended up like this? Had he always been this way? Did he ever wish things were different? And most of all, Lily wondered, did he ever wish people would stop treating him differently just because he was struggling? Lily found herself yearning for an answer. She couldn't just push these questions aside. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was simple when it clearly wasn't. And so, as the evening wore on and her mother settled into the couch with a book, Lily found herself standing up with an unexpected sense of purpose. "I think I'm going to visit Frank tomorrow," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. Her mother looked up, eyebrow raised. "Visit Frank?" Laura asked, a touch of confusion in her voice. "Why?" Lily shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I don't know. I think I need to talk to him. I need to understand." Her mother studied her for a moment, as though considering her daughter's sudden decision. Then, after a pause, she nodded slowly. "That's very thoughtful, Lily. But remember, not everyone wants to be approached. People like Frank who've been through hard things, they don't always like talking about it. You might just have to be there and listen." Lily nodded, but something inside her told her that listening wasn't going to be enough. She didn't want to just listen to Frank's story. She wanted to be part of it. She wanted to show him that she understood, that she saw beyond the walker, beyond the struggle, to the person he was underneath. The next day, Lily found herself standing in front of the store again. She had prepared herself, mentally, at least. She knew that talking to Frank might be awkward, that it might not go the way she imagined. But she had to try. She had to understand, and the only way to do that was to step into the unknown. As she entered the store, her heart pounded in her chest. There was a strange sense of anticipation, as though she were stepping into an unfamiliar territory. Her eyes scanned the aisles, but she didn't see Frank. He wasn't there at first. And for a moment, she was relieved. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe she could just go about her usual shopping, avoid the uncomfortable conversation, and continue to live in the world she had always known. But just as she turned the corner toward the dairy section, she spotted him, Frank. He was standing by the checkout counter, talking to Mr. Simmons again. This time, he looked over at Lily and gave her a small nod, as though he recognized her from the week before. The air in Lily's lungs seemed to freeze, but she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her way over to him. When she reached him, she paused for a second, unsure of what to say. But then, remembering her mother's words about listening, she finally spoke. "Hi, Frank," she said, her voice softer than she intended. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't mean to laugh last week. I didn't understand." Frank looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then, slowly, he gave her a small smile, a quiet, knowing smile, as if he had heard apologies like this before, but he didn't seem angry. In fact, he seemed to appreciate it. "You don't have to apologize, young lady," Frank said, his voice surprisingly warm. "It's all right. Not everyone understands what it's like. But sometimes, it's good that people notice. It means they care. And that's the first step." Lily stood there, speechless for a moment. There was so much more she wanted to say, but in that instant, it was as though the weight of the past was being lifted from Frank's shoulders, just a little, and she was given a glimpse of something she hadn't expected to find: understanding. When Lily walked up to Frank the following week, her heart was in her throat. The words her mother had said to her the day before, about being respectful and open but not pushing too hard, echoed in her mind. What was she hoping for? She didn't really know. She had only known that, in some strange way, she needed to do this. To break through that invisible barrier between herself and Frank, between someone who was struggling and someone who had never truly had to struggle. She didn't want to just look at Frank anymore. She wanted to see him. And to truly see him, she needed to listen, to ask, and to understand. Frank had been in the store when Lily entered, just as she had expected, his walker clicking against the linoleum floor as he made his way down the aisles. This time, however, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him with purpose. Frank's walker, the one he used every day, was no longer a symbol of something foreign or strange to her. It had become a marker of resilience. His slow but steady pace now made her think not of frailty, but of strength, strength that had been earned through years of battles, both internal and external. As Lily approached him, Frank looked up, his face softening into a gentle smile, though his eyes held the weight of lived experience that seemed far beyond Lily's years. He knew she was the same young girl who had laughed at him just days ago, but there was no bitterness in his expression, only a quiet recognition, as though he understood that she was trying, in her own way, to acknowledge something larger than herself. "Hello again, Miss Lily," Frank said, his voice warm but measured, a hint of curiosity in his tone. "How's your mother doing?" Lily swallowed hard, the familiar nervousness creeping up on her, but this time, she wasn't about to let it stop her. She had a reason for being here, a reason to open up, even if she didn't fully understand why yet. She wanted to take that step forward. She needed to know him. "She's good," Lily said, trying to steady her voice. I wanted to apologize again. For laughing. I didn't really know what was going on then. But I understand now. I think I get it." She paused, looking down at the walker, then back up at Frank. I wanted to ask, what happened? How did you end up needing the walker?" Frank's smile didn't falter, but there was a slight pause as he processed her question. It was a sensitive topic, of course, but the sincerity in Lily's voice gave him a sense of trust. He could see that this young girl was no longer the child who had laughed at him, but someone who was seeking to understand. His story, the story of how he had come to need the walker, was one of loss and survival. He had told it many times before, but with Lily, it felt different. She wasn't just looking for a story. She was looking for a connection. "Well, Lily," Frank began, his voice low but steady, "I was a young man once, like you. I joined the army when I was about 18. The war, it came when I was still just a boy. The things I saw and the things I did, it changes you. You can't go through something like that without it leaving a mark. Some marks you can't see. Some you can. My leg, that's one of the marks you can see." Lily's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected him to open up so quickly, but the words he spoke weren't ones of anger or regret. They were words of acceptance. Words that, to him, were part of the fabric of who he was. They were heavy with meaning, but they were also a testament to how far he had come. He paused for a moment, his gaze flickering off to the side as if he were seeing something far beyond the grocery store, far beyond the present moment. "I was in a battle, a firefight that went on for days. The kind of thing where you lose track of time and all you care about is staying alive and getting the hell out of there. I got hit during one of those battles. Shrapnel from an explosion tore through my leg. I didn't think I was going to make it, but I did. I survived. The doctors did what they could, but in the end, it left me with this." He patted the metal frame of his walker with a hand that was steady, despite the years of hardship it had seen. "I can still walk, just not like I used to. Not the way I want to." Lily's throat tightened as she listened. She had expected some vague, distant explanation, but Frank's honesty hit her harder than she anticipated. It was one thing to hear about the impact of war in textbooks or from the news, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it, who had survived it, was something entirely different. "I'm sorry," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper, though the sincerity in her tone was undeniable. She didn't know what else to say. She didn't have the right words. How could she? How could anyone? Frank smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's all right, kid. You're not the first one to ask. And you won't be the last. A lot of people don't understand the reality of war, but I'm glad you asked. It means you're trying to understand. That's more than most people do." Lily nodded, grateful for Frank's kindness, but she still felt a distance between them. She wanted to help him, but how? What could she possibly do for a man like Frank, who had endured so much and yet still carried on? The weight of his story was heavy in her chest, but it was also beginning to change her. The reality of what he had been through, what he continued to live through, was something she could no longer ignore. It was the first time she truly understood that there was so much more to a person than what they appeared to be at first glance. As the conversation drifted into a lull, Frank cleared his throat and shifted his weight, adjusting himself on the walker. "You know," he said after a moment, "it's not just the leg that's hard to deal with. It's everything else. The loneliness, the days that drag on, the pain that doesn't go away, even if you don't always feel it." His voice dropped lower, and Lily had to strain to hear him. "The hardest part is living with it. People think that once the doctors patch you up, it's over. But it's not. It never is." Lily felt something shift inside her. There was an understanding now, a sense that Frank wasn't just a figure in a grocery store, but a man with a history, a legacy of sacrifice, and a reality that most people, especially her, couldn't even begin to imagine. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would make him feel seen and heard, but she knew she had to be careful. Words had power, but they also had limits. Sometimes just listening was enough. And so, she remained quiet, her gaze steady on him. Frank seemed to sense her silent support. He gave her a knowing smile and said, "You've got a good heart, Lily. I can see it in the way you're looking at me. It's not easy for people to look past the walker, past the limp. Most just see a man who's struggling. They don't see the person behind it all." Lily nodded again, feeling her own emotions begin to stir. It was as if Frank had given her a key to understanding not just his struggles, but the struggles of anyone who had been through something difficult and came out the other side. Life, she was starting to realize, wasn't as simple as she once thought. People weren't defined by the outward signs of their pain or their past. There was always more to their stories. And it was that story, that quiet, often invisible history, that truly defined them. For the rest of their conversation, Lily remained present with Frank. She listened carefully, asked the occasional question, but mostly, she absorbed. She absorbed the weight of his words, the wisdom in his voice, and the kindness in his eyes. It was an unspoken agreement between them. She didn't need to fix anything for him, and he didn't need to fix her. They could simply be two people, sharing a moment, learning from each other. When it was time for Frank to leave the store, he waved goodbye to Lily with a small, appreciative nod. "Take care, Lily," he said. "You've got a good heart. Don't ever let it harden." Lily watched him go, her heart full of a quiet understanding. She knew that this was only the beginning for her, that she had taken the first step toward a deeper comprehension of the world. What she had learned from Frank that day was more than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about war or injury or survival. It was about empathy and how to recognize the humanity in others, no matter what struggles they carried. And as Lily turned to leave the store, her heart a little lighter than before, she knew that she would never again look at Frank or anyone else in quite the same way. The next few days felt like a haze for Lily. The conversation with Frank had stirred something inside her, a blend of empathy, curiosity, and guilt, but it also left her with a sense of confusion. She had gone into that moment hoping to learn something profound, but when she walked away from the store, she couldn't help feeling that the encounter had only scratched the surface of something much deeper. She had asked Frank about his past, listened to his story, and even apologized for her past ignorance. And yet, a small, nagging part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't really understood him at all. She had gotten the answers she thought she wanted. She had learned about his leg, the explosion, the shrapnel, and how it had all led him to rely on the walker. She had heard about his pain, his resilience, and even the quiet loneliness that followed him like a shadow. But despite all of that, there was a distance between them, one that Lily couldn't seem to bridge. There was no magical moment where everything clicked into place. There was no triumphant feeling of understanding. Instead, there was only a lingering sense of unease, as if something vital remained unsaid. Her mother had noticed the change in her. Lily had been quieter than usual, lost in her own thoughts. The girl who used to talk endlessly about school, friends, and the little details of her day now seemed distant, withdrawn. And when Laura asked her if she was all right, Lily had no real answer. She wasn't sure what was bothering her. She just felt unsettled, as if a new world had opened up to her, one that was far more complicated than she could navigate. The next Saturday, Lily found herself walking to the grocery store again, this time on her own. Her mother had needed to stay home, and so Lily had decided to go. It wasn't the usual, mundane trip to pick up a few items. It was something more. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but she felt drawn to the place where everything had started. She felt that there was still something she had left undone, some unspoken truth that had to be uncovered. As she walked into the store, she was almost immediately met by the familiar sight of Frank, standing in the same spot by the dairy aisle where they had first talked. His walker was resting beside him, but this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't moving around the store, doing his usual shopping. Instead, he was standing there, looking a little lost, staring at the shelves in front of him with a distant expression. Lily hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. It was strange, this feeling of wanting to reach out but not knowing exactly how. She had expected that once she understood Frank's past, once she'd made that initial connection, things would feel clearer. She had imagined that she would walk away feeling enlightened, with a new sense of purpose. But now, as she watched Frank, she realized that understanding his story hadn't given her the answers she had hoped for. In fact, it had made her more aware of her own limitations. She couldn't fix Frank's pain, nor could she solve the struggles of someone who had lived a life far different from her own. She couldn't just walk away feeling better about herself, as if she had done something noble. As she took a few tentative steps toward him, Frank noticed her right away. His eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment, there was a look of recognition, of understanding, that passed between them. It wasn't the same look that she had seen before, though. This time, it felt heavier, more knowing. It felt like he could see right through her, like he understood that her questions, her attempts to reach out, were born of a deeper discomfort that she hadn't fully confronted. "Well, hello again, Miss Lily," Frank said, his voice soft but steady. "Back in the store, huh? Been a while." Lily smiled nervously, unsure of what to say next. She had come here looking for something, but she wasn't sure exactly what that was. "Yeah, just needed to pick up a few things," she said, glancing at the shelves, feeling awkward. She didn't know how to get back into the conversation, didn't know how to pick up where they had left off. It felt like there was so much left unsaid between them, but at the same time, there was so much she didn't feel ready to ask. Frank nodded slowly, seemingly understanding her hesitation. "I know what it's like to feel like you're chasing something you can't quite reach," he said quietly, his gaze flickering toward tea. He shelves in front of him. "Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the answers don't come. The pain doesn't go away. You just learn to live with it." Lily's heart tightened as she listened to him speak. It was as if he had read her mind. She had been feeling exactly that way. The sense that, despite her best efforts, the world was still too large, too complicated to fully understand. She thought she had learned something by talking to Frank, but the more she tried to make sense of it, the more everything seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time," Lily said slowly, carefully choosing her words. "About how people think it's all over after the doctors patch you up. But it's not, is it? It's not just the leg. It's everything else." Frank looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "No, it's never just the leg," he said quietly. "It's the little things, too. The things people don't see. The things they don't understand." Lily felt a sharp pang in her chest. It was one thing to hear Frank talk about his injury, to understand the physical pain he had endured. But it was another thing entirely to realize that his battle wasn't over. That he was still fighting every single day with things that no one else could see. And that was where the truth of his struggle lay, not in the outward signs of injury, but in the silent, invisible battles he continued to fight. "I don't know what I can do for you, Frank," Lily said, her voice almost a whisper. I want to help, but I don't know how. I don't know what it's like to go through what you've gone through." Frank chuckled softly, the sound rough but not unkind. "You don't have to do anything, kid," he said. "You've already done more than most people. You've taken the time to listen. You've taken the time to care. That's all anyone really needs." Lily looked at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. She had thought that understanding his pain would be the key to solving everything, to making her feel better about herself, to making her feel like she had done something meaningful. But the truth was, she couldn't fix Frank. She couldn't make him feel whole again. All she could do was show him that she cared, that she saw him for who he was. And in some strange way, that was enough for him. But as Lily stood there, listening to Frank's words, she realized that it wasn't enough for her. She had wanted something more, something deeper. She had wanted to do more than just listen. She wanted to take away his pain. She wanted to change his world, just as she had wanted to change hers. She had gone into this experience with the naive hope that understanding would give her the power to make things better, but she now saw that this wasn't the case. Understanding wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a magic solution that would erase years of struggle and loss. It was a small step, a beginning, but not the end. For the next few moments, Lily stood in silence, processing the weight of what Frank had just said. The realization hit her with quiet force. She wasn't going to save him. She couldn't. She wasn't going to fix anything. But she could still show up. She could still listen. She could still offer him the one thing that most people didn't: her attention, her compassion, and her willingness to understand, even if she could never truly walk in his shoes. When Frank finally turned to leave, he gave her a small, knowing smile. "Take care, Lily," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And don't forget, sometimes the hardest thing to do is just keep going, even when you don't have all the answers." Lily watched him go, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. She had gotten what she wanted from this encounter. a deeper understanding of Frank's struggle, but also an unsettling realization about her own limitations. The victory she had imagined was not as simple as she had hoped. She had wanted to change things, to make everything better, but now she understood that true change wasn't always within her grasp. Sometimes, all she could do was keep showing up, and in doing so, she had already made a difference. The days following Lily's conversation with Frank left her feeling strangely unsettled, like the air after a storm, thick and heavy, as though something had changed, but the full weight of it hadn't quite settled. It wasn't just that Frank's story had made her feel guilty or sad. It was deeper than that. The understanding she had sought, the clarity she had longed for, had come at a price. She had believed that knowing Frank's struggle would somehow make her stronger, that it would answer the questions she had about pain, about sacrifice, and about what it truly meant to be brave. But now, the more she reflected, the more she realized that the answers she had sought hadn't given her peace. They had only left her with more questions, more doubts, and a deeper sense of helplessness. She began to notice things she hadn't seen before, the way people looked at Frank in the store, the way they moved around him as though he were an obstacle rather than a person. She had always been a perceptive child, sensitive to the moods and behaviors of others, but now she saw it with a clarity she hadn't experienced before. People didn't just glance at Frank, they looked away. When he paused in the aisles, they hurried past him, as though his presence were a reminder of something they didn't want to face. She saw the pity in their eyes when they caught sight of his walker, a quiet kind of discomfort that mirrored her own when she had first laughed at him.
And it made her sick.
It wasn't just strangers who avoided Frank. Her friends, too, began to distance themselves from her, as if they knew that something in her had changed. They hadn't been there when Frank shared his story. They hadn't seen the way Lily had looked at him with new eyes, as if everything she had thought she knew about the world had been flipped on its head. To them, Frank was just a man with a limp, someone they could easily dismiss or forget. To Lily, however, he was a symbol of all the things she had never understood, a stark reminder of her own privilege and naivete. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about his struggle, about the pain he carried silently every day. And yet, the more she thought about it, the less she could do to help him. She felt like a spectator in his life, watching him from the sidelines, but unable to make a real difference. It was Friday afternoon when Lily finally broke. It had been a week since she last spoke to Frank, and the unease that had settled in her chest had only grown more pronounced. She found herself standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the dishes her mother had left to wash, the smell of dinner lingering in the air. Her mother had asked her what was wrong more than once, but Lily hadn't had the words to explain it. How could she tell her mother that the weight of someone else's pain had shifted something in her? How could she explain that she didn't know how to make sense of the world anymore, of all the suffering and loss she had learned about from Frank? "You all right, sweetheart?" Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, and Lily turned to see her standing in the doorway, an expression of quiet concern on her face. "You've been awfully quiet these days."
Talk to me.
Lily swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. She wanted to tell her mother everything, the way Frank's story had haunted her, the way his injury had become an almost tangible weight she carried with her. She wanted to tell her that the world didn't feel the same anymore, that everything felt fragile and broken. But she couldn't find the words. She could only nod, offering a weak smile in response. "I'm fine, Mom," she muttered. "Just tired." Her mother looked at her for a long moment, and then, as though sensing that something deeper was at play, she sighed and gave a small, resigned shake of her head. "If you say so. But if you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here." Lily wanted to reach out, to tell her everything, but she couldn't. She wasn't sure she even understood what was going on inside her own head. What did it mean to care so deeply about someone else's suffering? What did it mean to feel responsible for something she could never fix? Her sense of helplessness was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, it wouldn't go away. That evening, she found herself back at the grocery store, walking aimlessly down the familiar aisles, her mind elsewhere. She had told herself she was just running an errand, just grabbing a few things for her mom. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the real reason she was here. She was looking for Frank, for some sense of clarity, for an answer to the questions that had been plaguing her since their last conversation. As she rounded the corner to the dairy section, she saw him immediately. Frank was standing by the same shelf where they had spoken before, his hand resting on his walker, his eyes fixed on the products in front of him. He looked tired, more so than usual, as though the weight of his years, his experiences, had finally caught up with him. His back was slightly hunched, and there was a weariness in his posture that made her heart ache. For a moment, she simply watched him, unsure of what to say. How could she approach him now? Was it too soon to talk to him again? Was he tired of her questions, tired of her attempts to understand? But something inside her pushed her forward. She couldn't leave without trying again, without confronting the storm of emotions that had been swirling inside her ever since that first conversation. "Hey, Frank," she called out, her voice tentative but clear. He turned, and his face lit up with a faint, welcoming smile, though his eyes still carried the weight of his inner world. "Lily," he said warmly, though his voice was quieter than usual. "Back again, huh?" She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to him. She had come here searching for some sense of closure, but now, standing in front of him, she realized that there was no simple resolution to be had. She couldn't just fix things with a few more words, a few more well-meaning questions. This was bigger than that. "I've been thinking," Lily said, her voice low, "a lot about what you said, about how you're still fighting, even when people don't see it. I think I finally get it." Frank looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" I thought that by understanding, I could make it better," Lily continued, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. "I thought that if I knew what you'd been through, I could somehow fix it. I could make it stop hurting. But now I realize that I can't. I can't fix it. I can't fix you." She felt the weight of her own words hit her like a cold wave. She had spent so much time trying to find a way to make Frank's pain go away, trying to make him feel better, that she had never stopped to realize that his pain wasn't something that could be fixed. It wasn't something that could be erased with kindness or understanding. It was a part of him, a part of who he had become. And by trying to change it, she had only been ignoring the truth of his experience. Frank's gaze softened as he listened to her, and when she finished speaking, there was a long silence between them. The kind of silence that was thick with emotion, with understanding, and with the recognition that both of them had been on a journey. But the destination wasn't where Lily had expected it to be. "You've got it, kid," Frank said quietly. "You can't fix me. No one can. This is just my life now. But that doesn't mean it's all bad. That doesn't mean there's no value in it. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from learning to live with the things that break you." Lily nodded slowly, feeling a weight lifting from her chest. For the first time since they had met, she felt like she was seeing Frank for who he truly was, not a symbol of pain and sacrifice, but a man who had found a way to keep going, despite everything. And for the first time, Lily realized that the price she had paid for understanding wasn't a loss at all. It was a gift. In that moment, she understood something profound. The price of understanding wasn't that it had to make everything better. The price was that it demanded a shift in how you saw the world, not as a place to be fixed, but as a place to be lived in, with all its complexities and struggles. And in that, there was a quiet kind of peace. Not the peace that came from fixing everything, but the peace that came from simply being present and accepting things as they were. As Frank turned to leave, his usual soft smile tugged at his lips. "Take care, Lily. And remember what I said, sometimes the hardest thing to do is just keep going." Lily watched him go, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time, she wasn't trying to fix anything. She was simply accepting it, and that, she realized, was enough. Lily's return to her familiar world was not as simple as stepping back into the life she had known before her conversations with Frank. The reality of her experience with him, the conversations, the realization, the understanding, had irrevocably changed the way she saw herself, the people around her, and even the world. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she could now see things in sharper detail, with greater clarity. What once seemed like a simple, untroubled life now felt complicated, layered, and full of truths that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Yet at the same time, she also felt an undeniable sense of growth, a sense that she had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that was not defined by the need to fix or understand everything, but by the quiet acceptance of the things she could not change. As she stepped back into her routine after her final conversation with Frank, it was impossible for Lily to return to the innocence she once had. The world, it seemed, had become infinitely more complex. She noticed everything now, the subtle ways people looked away when they saw someone struggling, the faint lines of exhaustion beneath the eyes of her classmates, the way people wore their pain, whether they spoke about it or not. It was as if she could no longer ignore the world's undercurrents, the invisible struggles that ran just beneath the surface of everyday life. Before, she had been too focused on her own world, her friends, her school, her family, to even consider the larger human condition. But now, those deeper currents were impossible to ignore. It wasn't that Lily was burdened by these realizations. Rather, she felt an almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. She could no longer afford to be the same carefree girl she had been. The people around her were struggling, some in ways that were visible, like Frank, and others in ways that were far less obvious. There was a pervasive kind of pain in the world, an undercurrent of difficulty that people carried with them but rarely showed. Frank had taught her that. He had shown her that pain, once experienced, didn't just disappear. It became a part of who someone was, a part of how they navigated the world. And although she couldn't take that pain away, she could at least acknowledge it. She could look at people and see them, really see them, in a way that she never had before. It was the beginning of a transformation in Lily, a kind of quiet awakening. She found herself listening more closely to the people around her. She paid attention to their words, to their actions, to their silences. She began to notice the subtle ways in which her friends and classmates hid their fears and insecurities, just as Frank had once hidden his pain behind the shield of his stoic silence. There was an empathy in her now that hadn't been there before, an empathy that wasn't just born of understanding another person's story, but of recognizing the universal nature of human suffering. It wasn't about trying to fix anyone. It was about being present, being aware, and offering what comfort she could, even if it was only the comfort of knowing someone saw them for who they really were. One afternoon at school, Lily found herself sitting in the lunchroom, looking around at her friends. She hadn't really talked to them about Frank or the realizations she had had, mainly because she didn't quite know how to explain it. They were still the same. Their conversations still revolved around the latest gossip, the newest trends, and the drama that seemed so important at the time. But for Lily, everything had shifted. The conversations felt shallow now, like they existed on a surface layer that she no longer wanted to be a part of. She didn't want to talk about who was dating who, or what the latest TV show was, or whether anyone had passed their last test. Those things didn't seem important anymore. What seemed important was something else entirely: understanding the people around her, recognizing their struggles, and offering support in ways that truly mattered. It was in the middle of one of these lunchroom conversations, one that Lily had barely been listening to, that she noticed something about her friend Mia. Mia was laughing, as usual, but her eyes seemed distant, distracted. She didn't look at Lily when she spoke, her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she fidgeted with her phone like she was trying to escape into it. Mia had always been the life of the party, the one who made everyone laugh, who had a seemingly endless supply of energy and enthusiasm. But now, Lily realized she was hiding something. There was a subtle sadness in Mia's demeanor that Lily couldn't ignore. It was the same sadness she had seen in Frank's eyes, only now she was seeing it in someone she knew, someone she cared about. Lily didn't say anything to Mia right then. She didn't feel that it was her place to force a conversation, especially not one as personal as this. But later that night, she found herself thinking about Mia, wondering what she was going through, what pain she might be hiding. Maybe Mia didn't have a visible injury like Frank, but Lily had learned that pain didn't always look the way you expected it to. It wasn't always a physical wound. Sometimes it was something much harder to see, the kind of pain that could make someone withdraw into themselves, even when they were surrounded by friends. The next day at school, Lily decided to take a chance. She didn't know if Mia was ready to talk, but she couldn't ignore what she had seen. So, during lunch, she sat down beside Mia, who looked up at her in surprise. Lily smiled softly and said, "Hey, are you doing okay?" Mia blinked, her expression changing from surprise to something more guarded. She hesitated before answering, her eyes flicking down to the table. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, but the way her voice cracked made Lily realize that the facade Mia had been putting up was beginning to crumble. "Are you sure?" Lily pressed gently. "I mean, I've just noticed that you've seemed a little off lately." Mia stared at her for a long moment, her fingers still playing with the edges of her phone. Then, finally, she sighed and looked up at Lily. "It's just, stuff. My parents are fighting a lot. I guess it's been getting to me." Lily nodded, her heart heavy. It wasn't something she had known before, but it made sense now. The quiet distance in Mia's behavior, the way she seemed to withdraw from everything, was a response to something deeper, something she had been keeping to herself. Lily had seen it before in Frank, the way people carried their burdens silently. She had seen how it wore people down, how it made them retreat into themselves when they didn't know how to cope. "I'm really sorry, Mia," Lily said softly. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But if you do, I'm here, okay? You're not alone." Mia smiled weakly, the first real smile she had given all week. "Thanks, Lily. I don't know what to do sometimes. It's like things are falling apart and I can't fix them." Lily nodded in understanding. "Yeah, I get that," she said quietly. "But you don't have to fix everything. You just need to get through it. And sometimes you don't have to do it alone." That was the beginning of a small but significant change in Lily's relationship with Mia. Over the next few weeks, Mia began to open up more to Lily, sharing the things that had been weighing on her. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't solve all of Mia's problems, but it was a start. It was the kind of connection that Lily had come to realize was the most important one, the kind that didn't require fixing or understanding everything, but simply being there for someone in their moment of need. Through Mia, Lily began to see the world even more clearly, how often people hid their pain, how frequently they tried to push it down in favor of appearing fine. But Lily had learned something crucial from Frank. It was okay to not be okay. It was okay to be broken and still keep going. It was okay to lean on others for support, to share your struggles, and to be open about your vulnerability. And even though she couldn't fix everything, she could be a part of the healing process, just by offering a listening ear, by showing that she saw and cared for the people around her. When she thought back to Frank and everything he had shared with her, Lily realized how far she had come. She had once thought that understanding someone's pain meant solving it. But now, she understood that the best thing she could offer wasn't solutions. It was empathy, presence, and acceptance. That was the new truth she carried with her, a truth that had cost her something but had also given her so much in return. Lily's world had shifted in ways she had never expected, but in the process, she had become a deeper, more compassionate person. She had learned that real strength wasn't about fixing things. It was about showing up, offering love, and accepting the things you couldn't change. And that, she realized, was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.